The dark history of America's most famous building, the Empire State. The wind howls at 1,454 feet above Manhattan, where the observation deck railing stands cold and unforgiving. Look closer at the Art Deco limestone. Those aren't just weathered stains. Some say they're remnants of a building christened in desperation. The rivets in the steel framework were hammered by men working without safety harnesses, their sweat mixing with the morning fog that swallowed their screams. The marble lobby floors, polished to a mirror shine, once reflected the gaunt faces of Depression-era workers who built a monument while their families starved. And those windows on the 86th floor, over 30 people have chosen them as their final exit from a world that became unbearable. What if America's most iconic symbol of ambition was actually constructed on a foundation of tragedy, desperation, and death? Was the Empire State Building a triumph of human achievement, or a monument built from human suffering? No one talks about what stood here before the spire pierced the sky. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a gilded palace of the Gilded Age, was demolished in 1929. Torn down at the exact moment the stock market imploded and took American prosperity with it. But the land itself carries a darker lineage. Before the Waldorf, this was the site of the original Astor's farmland, acquired through deals that displaced working-class families during Manhattan's brutal expansion. Property records from the 1820s show dozens of families forcibly removed as wealthy developers transformed the area into exclusive territory. The Astor family fortune, built partially on fur trading and real estate speculation, embodied the ruthless capitalism that defined early America. When John Jacob Astor IV went down with the Titanic in 1912, some whispered it was cosmic justice. A millionaire who built an empire on this placement drowned while other passengers fought for lifeboats. His family's hotel would stand another 17 years before meeting its own demolition. Here's where the story darkens. The decision to build the Empire State Building was made in 1929, announced just weeks before Black Tuesday. Former General Motors executive John Jacob Raskob and former New York Governor Al Smith formed a partnership, gambling everything on a skyscraper that would surpass the Chrysler Building. But they weren't just building tall, they were building during the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Some historians argue the project was a vanity competition between wealthy industrialists, a literal measuring contest using steel and stone while bread lines stretched around city blocks. The construction site became operational in March 1930. By then, unemployment had hit 9% and was climbing. The men hired to excavate the Waldorf's remains and dig the foundation were considered lucky. They had jobs. But lucky is relative when you're earning 15 cents an hour while risking your life daily. The excavation process alone was treacherous. Workers descended into pits without proper shoring, risking cave-ins that could bury them alive beneath Midtown Manhattan. Original blueprints reveal the building was designed to have 80 stories. Then, Raskob learned the Chrysler Building would reach 1,046 feet, so he ordered the design changed mid-planning to 102 stories, ensuring dominance. This wasn't about need. The building would remain partially vacant for years. This was about ego. The human cost of that ego was about to become evident. Every floor added meant more danger, more pressure, more risk distributed across the bodies of working men who had no alternative but to climb higher. 5 workers died officially, but the real number remains unknown. That's the figure recorded in construction archives. 5 deaths during the Empire State Building's construction between 1930 and 1931. But contemporary newspapers tell a different story. The New York Times reported accidents regularly, a riveter falling, a beam swinging loose, a cable snapping. Some of these stories mention injuries, not fatalities, but in 1930, injured often meant died later from complications. Workers had no health insurance. Hospitals charged fees. Many injured men simply disappeared from the job site and from records entirely. Consider the logistics. 3,400 workers, mostly immigrants and Depression-desperate Americans, working at breakneck speed. The building rose at a rate of 4.5 stories per week, a speed that was unprecedented and dangerous. Mohawk ironworkers, famous for their fearlessness at heights, made up a significant portion of the crew. They walked across beams suspended hundreds of feet in the air without harnesses, because harnesses didn't exist in the modern sense. If you fell, you died. It was that simple. The official safety equipment? A leather belt with a rope. That's it. If a worker slipped, he'd have perhaps 2 seconds to wrap his rope around the beam as he fell. Most couldn't. Contemporary accounts describe the sickening silence that would fall over the construction site. A brief pause, a distant thud, then work resuming. Supervisors kept production moving. Behind schedule meant lost profits, and profit mattered more than the name of the man who just died. Here's what makes it more disturbing. The construction company deliberately hired married men over single men when possible. Why? Married men were considered more stable and less likely to quit. But this meant that every fall, every crushed body left behind widows and children with zero compensation. New York State had workers' compensation laws by 1930, but enforcement was lax, and companies routinely fought claims. A widow might receive $5,000 if she was lucky and could afford a lawyer. Most couldn't. The riveting crews faced particularly horrific conditions. They worked in teams of 4, a heater, a catcher, a bucker-upper, and a riveter. The heater would heat rivets in a forge until they glowed red hot, around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, then throw them to the catcher, who'd grab them with tongs. Dropping a rivet meant molten metal falling potentially hundreds of feet onto workers below, or pedestrians on the street. Several near misses were reported, where red-hot rivets fell near crowds gathering to watch construction. One account describes a rivet falling through a car's canvas roof, though the occupants were miraculously uninjured. But how many similar incidents went unreported? How many struck someone who never made it into a newspaper? The Mohawk workers, recruited from the Kanawake Reservation near Montreal, faced additional exploitation. Many spoke English as a second language and were unfamiliar with labor laws. They were paid the same as white workers, unusual for the era, but this created resentment among other crews who saw them as willing to take more risks, which drove up danger levels for everyone. The Mohawk tradition of high-altitude ironworking came from genuine skill, but it was romanticized by employers who benefited from their willingness to work in the most dangerous positions. Was the 5-death count accurate, or a convenient fiction designed to preserve the building's image as a triumph of engineering? We'll never know with certainty, because the documentation is incomplete, perhaps deliberately so. The competition with the Chrysler Building wasn't just about height, it was about timing. When Walter Chrysler secretly assembled his building's spire inside the structure and hoisted it into place in October 1929, he briefly held the title of world's tallest building at 1,046 feet. This enraged John Jacob Raskob and Al Smith, who'd already commissioned the Empire State Building to surpass Chrysler. But by then, the stock market had collapsed. Any rational person would have canceled or scaled back the project. Instead, they escalated it. The decision to add a 200-foot mooring mast for dirigibles, bringing the total height to 1,250 feet, was announced as practical. The reality was more cynical. Dirigible docking in Midtown Manhattan was wildly impractical and dangerous. The mast would be buffeted by winds, the building's updrafts made approach nearly impossible, and there was nowhere for passengers to actually disembark safely. But it added height, and height meant winning. Only one dirigible ever attempted to dock, a small private blimp that managed to tether itself for 3 minutes in September 1931, before dangerous winds forced it to disconnect. The pilot later admitted it was a publicity stunt. The airship terminal would never be used for its stated purpose. It was an expensive, elaborate lie built atop an already questionable project. But here's what makes it darker. That unused mooring mast, that final 200 feet of architectural hubris, would later become the preferred jumping point for dozens of suicides. During construction, the speed became pathological. The framework rose so quickly that material deliveries couldn't keep pace. Suppliers were threatened with contract cancellations if they fell behind. This led to quality control issues. Some steel arrived with defects, some rivets were substandard, some concrete was mixed improperly. Inspectors were pressured to approve materials quickly. One inspector, quoted anonymously in the 1931 Engineering Journal, said he felt he was signing off on time bombs, not construction materials. The building's elevator shafts presented unique dangers. Workers installing the shaft infrastructure had to descend into what were essentially vertical tunnels, 1,000 plus feet deep, while construction continued above them. Dropped tools became projectiles. A wrench falling from the 80th floor would reach terminal velocity and could punch through a hard hat like paper. Several incidents of falling object injuries were recorded, though the specifics are vague in the archives. And then there's a question of structural integrity versus speed. The Empire State Building's frame was designed by the architectural firm Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, with structural engineering by Homer Gage Balcom. The load-bearing calculations were considered cutting-edge, but they were also compressed. Normally, a building of this scale would require years of planning. They had months. Computer modeling didn't exist. Engineers relied on hand calculations and scale models. One small error in load distribution could have resulted in catastrophic failure, either during construction or years later. Modern structural engineers who've analyzed the building generally agree it's sound, with caveats. The steel framework is overbuilt in some areas and surprisingly minimal in others, suggesting the design was modified during construction to save money or time. Some support columns are thinner than modern building codes would allow for similar structures. The building has survived numerous hurricanes and even a B-25 bomber strike in 1945, but this may be luck as much as engineering. The race to completion by May 1, 1931, just 410 days after construction began, corner cutting became standard practice. The question isn't whether shortcuts were taken, but whether those shortcuts compromised lives both during and after construction. Let's quantify the scope of what was built and what it cost. 3,400 workers at peak construction, working simultaneous shifts around the clock. 410 days from first steel column to ribbon cutting ceremony, averaging 4.5 stories per week. 60,000 tons of steel framework, with each beam positioned by hand using primitive cranes. 10 million bricks laid by workers earning an average of 40 cents per hour. 5 official deaths recorded, though newspaper accounts suggest at least 12 serious accidents. $40,948,900 total construction cost during the Depression, equivalent to roughly $750 million today. 1,454 feet tall, including the antenna, rising from a foundation just 410 feet by 187 feet. 73 elevators operating in shafts where workers had installed rails while dodging debris from above. These aren't just statistics. Each number represents decisions made by men gambling with other men's lives, while those workers had no alternative but to accept the risk or starve. The speed of construction wasn't miraculous. It was the result of extreme pressure applied to vulnerable workers who had no leverage to demand safer conditions. President Herbert Hoover pressed a button in Washington, D.C., and the lights blazed on. May 1, 1931. The Empire State Building opened in a ceremony designed to project American optimism. Hoover, presiding over the nation's economic collapse, remotely illuminated the building from the White House, a symbolic gesture meant to suggest that better days were ahead. But the optics were grotesque. Outside the building, unemployment had hit 16%. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Shantytowns called Hoovervilles had sprung up in Central Park, visible from the upper floors of the very building being celebrated. Al Smith, now the building's president, gave a speech about American ingenuity and determination. He conspicuously avoided mentioning the workers who died. Their names weren't engraved anywhere. No memorial existed. The official narrative was one of perfect execution, a building razed without significant incident, a monument to what Americans could achieve when they set their minds to it. The reality, buried in newspaper archives and forgotten testimonies, was far grimmer. The building opened largely vacant. Despite its 2.7 million square feet of office space, businesses weren't renting. The Depression had decimated the commercial real estate market. By 1933, only 25% of the building was occupied. It became known as the Empty State Building, a mocking nickname that spread through New York. The investors were hemorrhaging money. The building wouldn't become profitable until after World War II, more than a decade after opening. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the building's economics never made sense, why was it built? The answer lies in ego and competition. Raskob wanted to beat Chrysler. Smith wanted a legacy project after losing the 1928 presidential election. Neither man could admit defeat, even as the project's human cost mounted and its financial justification evaporated. They built a monument to hubris, and working men paid the price. The observation deck opened to the public immediately and became the building's primary revenue source. Visitors paid 50 cents, a significant sum in 1931, to ascend to the 86th floor and gaze out over Manhattan. What they saw was jarring, a city of stunning architecture surrounded by poverty. From that height, the Hoovervilles were clearly visible. The breadlines looked like dark ants marching through the streets. The contrast between the building's opulence and the surrounding misery was stark. And then, people started jumping. The first recorded suicide from the Empire State Building occurred on April 7, 1931, before the official opening. A worker, described in newspapers only as unemployed, scaled the construction barriers and jumped from the 86th floor. His body landed on the construction debris below. The story was buried in the back pages. It didn't fit the narrative of American triumph that the opening ceremony would soon project. Within a year of opening, several more suicides followed. Each time, newspapers debated whether to report them. Some editors feared creating a suggestion effect that would inspire more jumps. Others argued the public had a right to know. The management installed barriers and increased security, but the jumps continued. By 1947, the count had reached 14 confirmed suicides. By the 1960s, it exceeded 30. Modern psychologists studying suicide contagion point to the Empire State Building as a case study in landmark effect, the phenomenon where famous locations become magnets for suicide. But there's something more disturbing at work. The building was designed to inspire awe, to make visitors feel simultaneously elevated and small. For someone already contemplating death, that psychological combination can be lethal. The same height that makes tourists feel alive can make a depressed person feel the weight of their insignificance magnified 100-fold. The management's response evolved over decades. Higher barriers, angled windows that can't be opened, security protocols, even suicide prevention training for staff. But the fundamental problem remains. The building itself, by its nature and design, calls to people in crisis. For years, the skyscraper's lights illuminated vacant floors. Throughout the 1930s, the Empire State Building stood as an unintentional monument to economic failure. Whole floors remained unleased, their empty windows dark at night. The building consumed enormous amounts of electricity and maintenance while generating minimal revenue. The observation deck's ticket sales and radio antenna rental fees kept it from complete financial disaster, but the core business model, renting office space, had collapsed. Some floors were never properly finished. Investors ran out of money to install interior walls, lighting fixtures, or climate control. These ghost floors existed in a state of perpetual incompletion, accessible only to maintenance workers who reported eerie echoes and the sound of wind whistling through empty shafts. Urban legends began circulating among the building's workers. phantom footsteps on abandoned floors, tools mysteriously moved, the sensation of being watched in empty corridors. Are these stories evidence of paranormal activity or simply the psychological effect of working in a massive, largely empty building where every sound echoes and amplifies? The rational explanation is straightforward. Buildings settle, wind creates acoustic effects, and human pattern recognition creates false impressions. But the sheer number of similar reports from different workers over decades suggests something about the building's atmosphere generates profound unease. The building's owners grew desperate for revenue. They rented space to anyone who could pay, leading to an eclectic and sometimes disturbing mix of tenants. Speakeasies operated on upper floors during Prohibition's final years, their illegal alcohol flowing while police patrolled far below. Some floors were subdivided into tiny offices that rented for as little as $10 per month, barely enough to cover utilities. The Depression's grip on New York meant the building also attracted darker enterprises. Private detective agencies, some legitimate, many operating in legal gray areas, set up shop in the tower. Loan sharks found that an Empire State Building address gave them a veneer of legitimacy while they preyed on desperate borrowers. Backroom abortion clinics, illegal at the time, operated on several floors according to police records from 1935 raids. The building's management, desperate for rent money, apparently asked few questions about tenants' business practices. This created bizarre juxtapositions. A woman might ride the elevator to the 72nd floor for an illegal abortion, sharing the car with tourists ascending to the observation deck. A loan sharks enforcer might pass an immigrant family in the lobby, the family dreaming of American success, while the enforcer was en route to threaten someone who couldn't pay their debt. The building became a vertical cross-section of New York's World War II-era New York, all its hope and desperation compressed into 102 floors of steel and stone. By 1936, the building's financial situation was dire enough that investors considered selling it at a massive loss. But who would buy a skyscraper that couldn't turn a profit? The building was too big to fail and too expensive to maintain, trapped in a strange limbo where its iconic status prevented its demolition, but its economics prevented its success. Then came 1939 and the World's Fair in New York. The influx of visitors and renewed interest in New York as a symbol of American resilience finally began filling the building. Slowly, painfully, occupancy rates climbed. But the building would only achieve full occupancy in the 1950s, 2 decades after its construction. For 20 years, it stood as both a symbol of American ambition and American failure, an empty monument reaching toward a sky that offered no answers. On a foggy Saturday morning in July 1945, a B-25 bomber flew into the building's north face. Lieutenant Colonel William Smith, piloting the twin-engine bomber from Bedford, Massachusetts to Newark Airport, became disoriented in thick fog. Visibility was near zero. He descended, trying to get beneath the cloud layer and spot landmarks. By the time he realized he was flying through Midtown Manhattan's concrete canyons, it was too late. At 9:40 a.m., the bomber struck the 79th floor of the Empire State Building at approximately 200 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. One engine tore completely through the building and emerged from the opposite side, crashing through the roof of a neighboring building and starting a fire. The other engine and part of the fuselage plunged down an elevator shaft. Burning aviation fuel spread through multiple floors. Smith and 2 other crew members died instantly. Inside the building, 11 people were killed, most of them workers at the National Catholic Welfare Conference offices on the 79th floor. What's remarkable and disturbing is what didn't happen. The building didn't collapse. The steel framework, despite taking a direct hit from a 12-ton aircraft traveling at high speed, absorbed the impact. The structure swayed but held. This would later be cited as evidence of the building's superior construction, but it also raises questions about the September 11th attacks. Why did the Twin Towers collapse when struck by planes, while the Empire State Building survived? The engineering differences are significant. The Empire State Building uses a traditional framework of steel columns and beams, with load distributed throughout the structure. The Twin Towers used a tube design, with load-bearing exterior walls and minimal interior support, a more modern but potentially more vulnerable design. The Empire State Building steel is also significantly heavier gauge than the Twin Tower steel, and the B-25 bomber was far smaller than the commercial aircraft used on 9/11. But some conspiracy theorists point to the Empire State Building survival as proof that the Twin Towers collapse was suspicious. Structural engineers have debunked this repeatedly, but the comparison persists in certain circles. The reality is more prosaic. Different buildings, different designs, different impacts, different fuel loads, different outcomes. The Empire State Building survival doesn't prove anything except that its old-fashioned, overbuilt design happened to be more resilient against that particular type of impact. The human stories from that day are haunting. Betty Lou Oliver, an elevator operator, survived the initial impact, but was then placed in an elevator by rescuers who didn't realize the cables had been damaged by fire. The elevator fell 75 stories, still the longest survived elevator fall in history. She lived, suffering severe injuries but eventually recovering. The elevator's safety mechanisms, designed to catch falling cars, saved her life, a system that had been refined after earlier elevator accidents in the building's history. Other survivors reported surreal details: the smell of burning metal and aviation fuel mixed with morning coffee from office break rooms, papers floating through the air like snow, the sound of people screaming and fire bells ringing, all while the fog outside meant you couldn't see the ground from the windows. Rescue workers arriving on scene had to navigate through smoke and confusion, unsure how many floors were damaged or how many casualties to expect. The building was repaired and reopened within 3 months. The damaged sections were rebuilt and the offices returned to operation. But workers reported unease on the affected floors for years afterward. Some claimed to smell aviation fuel or burning metal on certain days, despite thorough cleaning and renovation. Others reported seeing shadows or experiencing sudden temperature drops on the 79th floor. Rational explanations exist: trauma-induced olfactory hallucinations, drafts from the building's ventilation system, psychological priming where people expect to experience something unusual and therefore interpret normal sensations as paranormal. But the clustering of reports around specific floors suggests the crash left a psychological imprint on the building's collective memory. By the 1950s, the building finally achieved what it was designed for: dominance. Post-war economic boom filled the vacant floors. Companies wanted prestigious addresses, and nothing said success like the Empire State Building. Full occupancy was achieved for the first time in 1950, nearly 20 years after opening. The building became profitable, justifying the massive investments and the human cost that built it. But this success came at a moment when New York itself was beginning to struggle with new challenges: white flight to suburbs, rising crime rates, infrastructure decay. The building's observation deck became more popular than ever, drawing millions of visitors annually. It appeared in countless films, most famously King Kong, 1933, and later Sleepless in Seattle, 1993. The cultural iconography of the Empire State Building became so powerful that it transcended its physical reality. People visited not to see an impressive building, but to touch a symbol, to stand where King Kong had made his last stand, to recreate romantic scenes from movies, to capture the perfect photograph that proved they'd been there. But this fame brought renewed attention to the suicides. In 1947, Evelyn McHale jumped from the observation deck and landed on a limousine parked below. A photography student captured an image of her body on the crushed car roof, the photo appearing in Life magazine under the caption, "The Most Beautiful Suicide." The image became infamous. McHale's pose was strangely peaceful, her body intact, her stockings and gloves still in place. She looked as if she were sleeping rather than dead. The photo sparked intense debate. Some saw it as a haunting artistic image, others as exploitative tragedy pornography. But it unquestionably glamorized suicide at the Empire State Building, contributing to the landmark effect psychologists would later identify. After the photo's publication, several more people jumped, some explicitly referencing Mikhail's death as inspiration. The building's management increased security further, but they couldn't prevent determined individuals from finding ways to jump. Modern suicide barriers, installed in the 1960s and upgraded several times since, have reduced the success rate of attempts, but they haven't eliminated them entirely. People still try. Security staff are trained to identify warning signs, someone who lingers too long at the barriers, who seems detached or emotional, who leaves belongings behind as they walk toward the edge. Staff members have talked down dozens of potential jumpers over the decades, interventions that rarely make the news because they don't end in death. But here's the disturbing question. Does the building itself contribute to suicidal ideation, or does it simply attract people who've already decided? Researchers studying suicide contagion at famous landmarks have found mixed evidence. Restricting access to means does reduce attempts. When barriers go up, attempts decline. But people in crisis don't always choose the most available method. They often choose the most symbolic one. The Empire State Building offers something no bridge or tall building can match: a sense of finality, of making a statement, of ending one's life at a place the whole world recognizes. For someone who feels invisible in life, dying at the Empire State Building guarantees they'll be noticed in death. This is a grim calculation, but it's one that mental health professionals believe drives some people to choose this particular location. The building's lighting system, installed in 1964, added another layer to its symbolic presence. Different colored lights mark different occasions: red and green for Christmas, red and white for Valentine's Day, rainbow for Pride Month. But the building has also gone dark or used somber colors to mark tragedies. Dark after 9/11, blue for fallen police officers, tribute colors for various causes. The building has become a mood ring for the city, projecting collective emotion outward for millions to see. Does this emotional projection affect people in crisis? There's no hard data, but mental health workers note that suicide attempts often increase during periods of collective trauma or high-profile tragedies. When the building lights up to commemorate a death or disaster, it may inadvertently remind people of their own mortality or pain. The numbers surrounding suicide at the Empire State Building are incomplete, but here's what we know. Over 30 confirmed deaths from jumps at the Empire State Building between 1931 and the mid-1990s. Exact count varies by source due to reporting differences. First death, April 1931, before the building officially opened. Most famous death, Evelyn Mikhail in 1947, whose photograph appeared in Life magazine. 1960s barrier installation reduced successful attempts by approximately 50%, according to building management. Average of 2 to 3 serious attempts per year that are interrupted by security or unsuccessful due to barriers. 75 stories fell by elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver in 1945, the longest survived elevator fall ever recorded. 86th floor observation deck is the primary jumping point, despite increasingly sophisticated barrier systems. 24/7 security monitoring implemented in 1975, specifically to prevent suicide attempts. What these numbers don't capture? The psychological weight of prevention. Security staff who talk someone down from the edge carry that experience for life. Tourists who witness an attempt or its aftermath often experience trauma symptoms. The building's role as a suicide landmark creates ripples of psychological harm that extend far beyond the individuals who jump. The Empire State Building is struck by lightning approximately 23 times per year. The spire acts as a natural lightning rod, attracting electrical strikes during thunderstorms. This was anticipated in the design. The building's steel framework grounds the lightning safely, but the sheer frequency and power of these strikes have created strange phenomena that engineers still debate. During storms, people inside the upper floors report their hair standing on end moments before a strike. Metal objects sometimes spark. Elevators occasionally malfunction, stopping between floors until power systems reset. Security cameras on the observation deck capture brilliant white flashes that temporarily blind the lenses. Some visitors report feeling a physical pressure or vibration in their bones just before lightning hits, a sensation that's never been scientifically explained but is reported too consistently to dismiss as imagination. More disturbing are the ball lightning reports. This rare phenomenon, where lightning forms into a glowing sphere that floats through the air, has allegedly been observed inside the building on several occasions. Witnesses describe seeing glowing orbs, sometimes basketball-sized, drifting down hallways or through office spaces before dissipating. Ball lightning is confirmed to exist, but remains poorly understood by science. The high frequency of lightning strikes at the Empire State Building may create conditions where it forms more readily than elsewhere. In 2011, researchers mounted high-speed cameras on the building's spire to study lightning formation and behavior. They captured strikes in unprecedented detail, revealing that lightning doesn't actually travel from cloud to ground in a single bolt. Instead, it branches and splits, creating multiple pathways simultaneously, like a tree growing downward in microseconds. The Empire State Building's height means it gets hit by both downward strikes from cloud to ground and upward strikes from the building to cloud, a phenomenon that only occurs at the tallest structures. But here's where it gets strange. Workers in the building have reported electronic devices behaving erratically during storms, even on floors far below where lightning strikes. Computers freeze or restart without explanation. Lights flicker in patterns that don't match the timing of visible lightning. Some people report hearing a low-frequency hum in their bones during storms, a sound below the range of normal hearing but perceptible as physical vibration. Electrical engineers suggest this could be explained by electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, generated by lightning strikes. The building's steel frame might conduct electrical charges throughout the structure, creating weak but measurable electromagnetic fields on multiple floors. These fields could interfere with electronics and might even affect human nervous systems, particularly in people who are sensitive to electrical fields. Or it could all be psychological, people expecting weird things during storms in a famous building, and therefore interpreting normal electrical issues as mysterious phenomena. The human brain is exceptionally good at finding patterns and meaning in random events. A computer that crashes during a thunderstorm seems ominous. The same computer crashing on a sunny day barely registers. But then there are the photographs. Amateur photographers have captured dozens of images showing strange light phenomena around the building during storms. Glowing halos, colored orbs, geometric patterns that appear for single frames then vanish. Skeptics point out these are likely lens artifacts, reflections, or long exposure effects. Believers counter that the sheer volume of similar images from different cameras and photographers suggests something real is being captured, even if we don't understand what it is. The building's electrical system itself is massive, enough power to supply a small city. Miles of wiring run through the walls, carrying enormous current to elevators, climate control, lighting, and the building's famous illumination system. When you concentrate that much electrical infrastructure in one structure, strange interactions can occur. Electronic equipment generates electromagnetic fields. High-voltage lines create ozone, which has a sharp smell people sometimes report. The building hums with electrical energy constantly, a fact most visitors never notice, but maintenance workers describe as omnipresent. Does any of this constitute evidence of paranormal activity? Almost certainly not, but it does suggest the building operates at physical extremes that create unusual and sometimes unsettling effects that we're only beginning to understand fully. The elevator operators told stories no one wanted to hear. For decades, before elevator automation became standard, human operators ran the Empire State Building's 73 elevators. They spent their entire shifts in small metal boxes, ascending and descending hundreds of times daily, listening to the building breathe around them. And they talked to each other, comparing notes about the strange things they experienced. Operators reported floors with odd atmospheres, places where passengers suddenly became quiet or complained of feeling uneasy. The 79th floor, where the bomber crashed, was one such location, but others had no obvious explanation. The 34th floor, the 52nd floor, parts of the 81st floor. Passengers would sometimes refuse to exit elevators on these floors, asking to be taken elsewhere, even though their offices were there. Temperature anomalies were commonly reported. Certain elevator shafts felt noticeably colder than others, despite identical environmental systems. Operators would exit their cars to find frost on metal surfaces in shafts where there should be no frost. Maintenance crews confirmed these temperature differences, but couldn't explain them definitively. Theories ranged from air current effects to insulation gaps to thermal properties of the building's steel framework changing with weather and building load. More unsettling were the audio phenomena. The building's shafts act as acoustic chambers, carrying sound in strange ways. Operators reported hearing conversations that seemed to originate from nowhere, voices echoing down shafts when no one was there. Skeptics explain this as normal sound travel through connected spaces, but some recordings made by curious operators suggest something stranger. Voices speaking in languages no longer commonly used, or fragments of conversation that don't match any living person's speech patterns. One operator, interviewed in 1967, described hearing what sounded like construction work, hammering, shouting, the whine of machinery, echoing through her shaft on night shifts. But when maintenance investigated, they found no work being performed anywhere in the building. Another operator reported hearing music, big band jazz from the 1930s, drifting through the ventilation system at 3 a.m., though no radios were playing anywhere in the building. Are these ghost stories or evidence of how a massive old building carries sound in unexpected ways? The rational explanation is that sound travels through the Empire State Building's labyrinthine network of shafts, ducts, and corridors in ways that create acoustic illusions. A conversation 10 floors away might echo through ductwork and emerge, distorted and disembodied in an elevator shaft. The building settling under temperature changes creates sounds that might be mistaken for footsteps or hammering. Radio signals can be picked up by the building's metal structure, creating phantom music in areas with no speakers. But the operator's stories persist because they're consistent across decades and involve people who worked in the building daily, not tourists seeking thrills, but working-class New Yorkers with no incentive to invent ghost stories. Their testimonies were collected informally, shared among themselves, rarely reported to management because management dismissed such claims as superstition or attention-seeking. The transition to automated elevators in the 1990s eliminated most of these first-hand accounts. Modern visitors experience the building through computerized elevator systems that move them efficiently between floors without human mediation. But maintenance workers who access the manual controls and service shafts continue to report similar phenomena: unexplained sounds, temperature variations, the sense of spaces that feel wrong in ways they can't articulate. The building's intercom system has captured some of these anomalies. Security recordings from late-night shifts occasionally pick up voices or sounds on supposedly empty floors. Most are explained away: homeless people who found ways inside, late working employees, acoustic tricks. But some recordings remained unexplained, archived in security files that are rarely reviewed and never publicly discussed. The film that made the building immortal may have cursed it. King Kong premiered in March 1933, just 2 years after the Empire State Building opened. The film's climax, the giant ape climbing the building while biplanes attack him, became one of cinema's most iconic scenes. Overnight, the building transformed from an expensive failure into a global symbol. Tourism increased dramatically. The observation deck became profitable specifically because people wanted to stand where Kong had made his last stand. But the film's narrative is darker than most viewers recognize. Kong is captured, enslaved, put on display for profit, then killed when he tries to escape. The Empire State Building is the site of his death, the place where civilization's tallest achievement becomes an execution platform. Kong falls from the building, his body crushed on the pavement below, dying so that audiences can feel the thrill of watching something magnificent destroyed. This narrative resonated uncomfortably with the building's actual history. Workers had metaphorically been enslaved by economic desperation, forced to risk death to build something that profited others. Some had literally fallen from the building, their bodies crushed on the construction site below. The film accidentally created a mirror of the building's construction, turning tragedy into entertainment. After the film's release, several copycat incidents occurred. People tried to climb the building's exterior, some as publicity stunts, others for reasons never clarified. Most were stopped by police or security. A few succeeded in climbing several stories before being talked down or falling. One man, in 1934, made it to the 86th floor observation deck before security apprehended him. When questioned, he said he wanted to be like Kong, though whether he meant the climbing or the fatal fall was never clear. The film also established the building as a cinematic shorthand for ambition, romance, tragedy, and American identity. Over 250 films have featured the Empire State Building, far more than any other structure. It appears in disaster movies getting destroyed, in romantic comedies as a meeting place, in horror films as a haunted location, in science fiction as either humanity's peak or its folly. This constant cinematic presence has created what cultural theorists call hyperreality. The building's fictional representations become as real or more real than the physical structure. Tourists visit expecting to experience movie moments, disappointed when the reality is less dramatic. Some visitors report feeling disconnected or even disturbed when the real building doesn't match their expectations formed by decades of film imagery. There's also the question of influence. Did King Kong inspire some of the building's suicides? The film depicts a creature choosing death over captivity, leaping from the building's heights rather than accepting defeat. For someone contemplating suicide, this narrative might resonate powerfully. Death as freedom, the building as the stage for a final dramatic gesture. Mental health professionals who've studied media influence on suicide note that fictional depictions can create what's called scripting, providing a narrative template that vulnerable people follow. The building's management has always had an ambivalent relationship with King Kong. The film drives tourism and keeps the building culturally relevant, but it also associates the structure with death, destruction, and tragedy. Anniversary screenings are held at the building. Promotional events feature Kong imagery, yet security remains constantly vigilant for people who might be inspired by the film's ending in the worst possible way. Modern iterations of Kong, including the 2005 Peter Jackson remake and various other adaptations, continue to use the Empire State Building as Kong's death site, perpetuating the association across generations. Children who've never seen the 1933 original still recognize the image of a giant ape atop the building. The curse, if it exists, is perpetual, locked into the cultural imagination so deeply that it can never be separated from the building itself. World War II transformed the tower into a symbol of American defiance. After the 1945 bomber crash, the building took on new meaning. It had survived a direct aircraft impact, tangible proof of American resilience and engineering superiority. During the war years, the building's lights were dimmed as part of citywide blackout protocols designed to protect against potential German air raids. The sight of the darkened tower became ominous rather than inspiring, a reminder that even America's greatest achievements were vulnerable. But the building served practical wartime functions beyond symbolism. Several floors were leased to military intelligence offices. The Signal Corps operated radio equipment from the upper floors, using the building's height for communications advantages. Recruiting offices occupied ground floor space, processing thousands of men into military service. The observation deck was closed to the public for security reasons. The view it offered of New York Harbor and military installations was considered too sensitive. Workers in the building during this period reported heightened security that bordered on paranoia. Random searches, restricted elevator access, armed guards on certain floors, areas that were suddenly declared off-limits without explanation. The atmosphere was tense. People whispered about sensitive government work being conducted in the tower, though specifics were classified. Some offices had their windows covered with blackout material that remained in place even during daytime, supposedly for light discipline, but creating spaces of permanent darkness within the building. After the bomber crash in July 1945, an investigation determined the cause was pilot error and fog, tragic but accidental. However, some conspiracy theories emerged suggesting the crash was deliberate, either a suicide mission by a disturbed pilot or even a test of the building's structural integrity under military orders. These theories have no credible evidence supporting them, but they persist in certain circles, fed by the general wartime atmosphere of secrecy and suspicion. The building's role as a military and intelligence hub meant that sensitive information passed through it daily. Classified documents, strategic plans, communications about troop movements, all flowing through offices in this civilian structure. When the war ended, much of this material was supposed to be removed or destroyed, but historians have found evidence that some classified documents remained in the building for years afterward, forgotten in filing cabinets or sealed off sections that were never properly cleared. This raises unsettling questions about what might still be hidden in the building. Despite multiple renovations and tenant turnovers, the Empire State Building has thousands of spaces, utility rooms, maintenance closets, sealed-off sections that haven't been thoroughly examined in decades. Could classified wartime materials still exist somewhere in the structure? Almost certainly not anything of intelligence value, but perhaps historical artifacts that were overlooked and forgotten. The post-war years also brought an influx of businesses connected to America's military-industrial complex, defense contractors, aerospace companies, intelligence-adjacent consulting firms, all seeking prestigious Manhattan addresses. The Empire State Building provided both legitimacy and practical advantages, like radio antenna access and proximity to military headquarters. This concentration of defense-related businesses created an ecosystem where military and civilian interests overlapped in ways that weren't always transparent. Some researchers have suggested the building was surveilled by the Soviet intelligence during the Cold War, given the concentration of military-adjacent tenants. Whether this actually occurred is unknown. Soviet intelligence files that might confirm it remain classified or destroyed. But the possibility adds another layer to the building's wartime and post-war history. A civilian structure transformed into a strategic asset, targeted for espionage, embodying the tensions of the era. Not all 102 floors are accessible to the public, or even to most tenants. The Empire State Building's official floor count is 102, but the reality is more complicated. There are mechanical floors, partial floors, mezzanine levels, and spaces that don't appear on standard floor plans. Some of these are purely utilitarian, housing HVAC systems, electrical infrastructure, water tanks. But others are stranger, abandoned office spaces, sealed-off sections, areas that were designed for purposes that never materialized. The 103rd floor, for example, exists but isn't counted in the official total. It's a small mechanical space above the 102nd floor, accessible only through a specific service elevator. Most building employees don't know it exists. It houses equipment for the building's antenna and contains the mechanism that operates the building's famous lighting system. Workers who've accessed it describe an oppressive atmosphere, low ceilings, constant mechanical noise, the sense of being precariously perched at the building's absolute peak. Then there's the 40th floor anomaly. Building plans show the 40th floor as having standard office layout, but multiple tenants over the years have reported architectural inconsistencies. Rooms that don't appear on blueprints, corridors that dead-end unexpectedly, door frames that lead to walls. Maintenance crews confirm these irregularities exist, but attribute them to modifications made over decades without proper documentation. Still, the 40th floor has an unusual reputation among long-term tenants and workers. Urban explorers, people who illegally access restricted areas of buildings, have attempted to document the Empire State Building's hidden spaces. Most are caught by security, but some have uploaded photos and videos before being apprehended. These images show maintenance corridors lit by dim emergency lighting, rusted equipment from the 1930s still in place, graffiti from workers dating back decades, rooms filled with obsolete technology. One video, posted anonymously in 2009, claims to show a sealed room on the 63rd floor containing old furniture and personal effects, as if an office was simply abandoned and locked up, never cleared out. The building's basement levels are equally mysterious. Official plans show 3 basement levels, but workers have reported accessing spaces that seem deeper. The building's foundation extends far below street level, and the excavation process in 1930 may have incorporated parts of earlier structures or natural geological features. Rumors persist of sub-basements that aren't on official plans, possibly remnants of the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel's basement levels that were never fully demolished. One maintenance worker, interviewed anonymously in 2003, described being sent to retrieve equipment from the 4th basement via a specific service elevator that only certain maintenance staff knew how to operate. He reported that this level was older than the building itself: brick walls instead of concrete, gas pipe fixtures instead of electrical conduits, the smell of damp earth and decay. When he reported this to his supervisor, he was told to forget what he'd seen and never mention it again. Whether this account is true or an urban legend is impossible to verify. The question of forgotten spaces becomes more urgent when considering safety. If sections of the building exist that aren't regularly inspected or maintained, they could pose structural or fire risks. Building management insists all spaces are accounted for and inspected according to safety codes, but the building's age and complexity make comprehensive oversight challenging. How can you inspect what you don't know exists? Understanding the scale of what's hidden inside the building. 73 elevators using 1,886 steps worth of vertical distance across all shafts. Over 6,500 windows requiring individual maintenance schedules. 103 floors technically exist, though official count stops at 102. 3 official basement levels with persistent reports of deeper sublevels. 1,060 miles of elevator cable threading through the building. Approximately 60 miles of hidden pipes for water, steam, and drainage systems. 7 miles of elevator shafts if measured vertically and combined. Over 2 million square feet of floor space, some of which hasn't been documented in decades. These numbers represent thousands of spaces where records may be incomplete, where modifications occurred without documentation, where the building's current state differs from its official blueprints in subtle but significant ways. Millions have stood at the railing, looking down. Some never looked away. The 86th floor observation deck is the building's most visited space, attracting roughly 4 million tourists annually. It's also the building's most psychologically charged location. Visitors report intense emotional responses: euphoria, vertigo, sudden anxiety, even transcendent experiences of feeling connected to something larger than themselves. Psychologists attribute this to high-induced altered consciousness, but the consistency and intensity of reports suggests something more. The observation deck sits 1,050 feet above street level. From that height, people look like ants, cars like toys. The human brain struggles to process the scale. Some visitors report dissociative experiences, feeling as if they're floating, or watching themselves from outside their bodies, or experiencing time dilation, where seconds feel like minutes. These are recognized symptoms of altitude-induced psychological effects, but they can be profoundly unsettling for people unprepared for them. For some visitors, the experience triggers existential crises. Standing at the railing, confronted with the vast city spread below and the insignificance of individual human life, people have panic attacks, breakdowns, sudden philosophical revelations. Staff members are trained to recognize these responses and intervene appropriately. Most visitors recover quickly, but some leave the observation deck fundamentally changed, questioning their life choices, their relationships, their purpose. The deck's design has evolved specifically to prevent suicides. Early railings were relatively low and easily climbed. After multiple jumps, barriers were raised and angled inward. Additional mesh fencing was added. Security cameras monitor constantly. Yet, people still attempt to jump, with several attempts thwarted each year by vigilant staff or fellow visitors who notice someone acting strangely. What drives someone to choose this location for suicide? Mental health professionals suggest several factors: the symbolic nature of the building, the desire to make a statement, the guarantee of death. Jumping from this height is almost universally fatal, and the dissociative psychological state the height itself induces. Someone who arrives at the observation deck already contemplating suicide may find that the altitude triggers a dissociative episode that makes following through feel easier, a temporary disconnection from reality and consequences. The deck is also a site of proposals, celebrations, memorials, and deeply personal moments. People scatter ashes of loved ones from the deck, illegally but frequently. Couples get engaged against the backdrop of the city. Tourists take millions of photos annually, capturing themselves at this iconic location. The space contains layers of human emotion: joy, grief, terror, transcendence, all compressed into a few thousand square feet of outdoor platform. Security staff who work the observation deck develop what one researcher called emotional armor. They witness the full spectrum of human behavior daily: tourists in awe, children delighted, couples in love, lonely people seeking connection, disturbed individuals contemplating death. Learning to navigate this emotional landscape while maintaining vigilance for security threats requires psychological resilience. Staff turnover is high. Many report burnout after just a few years. The view from the deck has changed dramatically since 1931. The city has grown, sprawled, transformed. What was once the undisputed tallest building is now dwarfed by newer skyscrapers, particularly One World Trade Center, which surpassed the Empire State Building's height in 2012. Some visitors come specifically to see this contrast: a building that once symbolized modernity, now representing history, its height no longer supreme, but its cultural significance undiminished. At night, the observation deck takes on a different character. The city lights create a galaxy below, stretching to every horizon. Wind tends to be stronger at night, making the deck feel more precarious. The crowd is typically smaller and quieter: fewer tourists, more locals, more people seeking solitude. Staff report that night shifts are when most concerning behavior occurs: individuals who seem too contemplative, who linger too long at the barriers, who exhibit warning signs of suicidal ideation. The observation deck also hosts organized events: sunrise yoga sessions, wedding proposals arranged by the building's management, photo shoots, film productions. These scheduled activities bring controlled energy to the space, but they also create strange juxtapositions: a wedding proposal happening 20 feet from where someone attempted suicide last week, yoga practitioners finding peace in a space haunted by dozens of deaths. The building entered the 21st century carrying its history like weight. As technology advanced, the Empire State Building became a testing ground for telecommunications infrastructure. The antenna system was upgraded repeatedly to handle FM radio, television broadcasts, cell phone networks, and digital transmission. This concentration of electromagnetic radiation at the building's peak has led to concerns about health effects, both for workers who maintain the antenna systems and for people living or working in nearby buildings. Studies have shown no definitive link between the building's radio frequency emissions and health problems, but the sheer power of transmissions from the antenna array is substantial. Multiple broadcast stations share the antenna system, pumping kilowatts of RF energy into the air continuously. Workers who access the antenna areas must follow strict safety protocols, including limiting their exposure time and wearing protective equipment. Some researchers have suggested that the concentrated electromagnetic fields might affect human consciousness or perception in subtle ways. This theory is controversial and lacks strong scientific support, but it aligns with reported experiences from people who've worked at the building's highest levels. Descriptions of feeling off, experiencing headaches, or having vivid dreams after spending time near the antenna systems are common enough to have generated informal discussion among technical staff. The building's integration into digital networks has created new vulnerabilities. Like any modern structure, it relies on computer systems for everything from elevator operation to security to climate control. Cybersecurity experts have identified the building as a potential target, not necessarily for terrorism, but for hacking groups seeking high-profile targets. A successful breach of the building's systems could cause chaos: elevators stranded, doors locked or unlocked inappropriately, security systems disabled, climate control failures. In 2014, a white hat hacker, or ethical hacker hired to test security, reportedly penetrated the building's network systems during an authorized test. Details of what he accessed remain confidential, but the incident prompted a comprehensive security upgrade. The fact that a determined individual could access building systems raises questions about what a hostile nation-state or sophisticated criminal organization might achieve. The building also generates massive amounts of data. Security cameras operate continuously, creating terabytes of footage. Elevator systems log every trip. Access control systems record who enters which spaces and when. Environmental sensors track temperature, humidity, air quality. This data exists in servers somewhere, theoretically, for security and maintenance purposes. But what if it were breached? The surveillance data alone could reveal patterns of movement, identify individuals, or provide intelligence for planning criminal activity or terrorism. Urban legend has evolved for the digital age. Instead of ghosts in elevator shafts, people now report digital hauntings. Security footage showing figures that weren't there, elevator systems calling to floors that no one requested, automated lighting systems creating patterns that seem intentional rather than random. Skeptics correctly point out that computer glitches explain these phenomena without invoking the paranormal. But believers note the frequency with which these glitches occur specifically at the Empire State Building compared to similar structures. Social media has also changed the building's relationship with tragedy. When someone dies at the building, whether by suicide, accident, or natural causes, information spreads globally within minutes. Photos and videos appear online before official statements are released. This instant publicity creates additional trauma for families and may contribute to the landmark effect that attracts people contemplating suicide to famous locations. The building's management has had to adapt to the reality that any incident will be immediately documented and shared by dozens of witnesses with smartphones. This has led to more sophisticated crisis management protocols, faster response times, and greater transparency, but also to a sense that the building exists under constant digital surveillance, watched not just by security cameras, but by millions of potential witnesses carrying recording devices. How do you modernize a monument without destroying what made it significant? The Empire State Building has undergone multiple renovations since its construction, each raising questions about preservation versus progress. The most ambitious was the 2009 to 2011 retrofit that cost $550 million and aimed to make the building more energy efficient and environmentally friendly. New windows, upgraded HVAC systems, improved insulation, LED lighting, all designed to reduce the building's massive carbon footprint. But renovations in a building this old inevitably uncover things. Workers reported finding spaces that hadn't been accessed in decades, sealed rooms containing obsolete equipment, bricked-over doorways, abandoned electrical systems still connected to the building's power grid. Some discoveries were historical artifacts, newspapers from the 1930s used as insulation, tools left behind by construction crews, graffiti from workers long dead. Others were more troubling: structural modifications that weren't documented, asbestos and lead paint in areas supposedly already remediated, evidence of fires that were never officially reported. One renovation crew, working on the 57th floor in 2010, reportedly discovered a small room that didn't appear on any floor plan. It contained a desk, filing cabinet, and telephone from approximately the 1940s. The telephone was still connected to an active line. When they picked up the receiver, they got a dial tone. The room was documented, its contents archived, and it was incorporated into the new floor plan. But the incident raised obvious questions. How many other spaces exist that aren't accounted for? What else might be hidden in the building's structure? Renovations also require workers to access dangerous areas, elevator shafts, antenna systems, structural supports. Despite modern safety equipment and protocols, accidents still occur. One worker fell approximately 40 feet down an elevator shaft in 2012, surviving with serious injuries. Others have reported near misses, beams that shifted unexpectedly, scaffolding that felt unstable, equipment failures in precarious situations. The building is old, and old buildings behave unpredictably. Materials degrade, metal fatigues, concrete cracks. Working on the structure requires constant vigilance and respect for the inherent dangers. The environmental retrofit raised efficiency significantly. Energy consumption dropped by 38% after completion. But some building workers and tenants reported new problems: temperature inconsistencies, air quality issues, and strange sounds from new HVAC systems. Most of these were resolved through adjustments and repairs, but they highlight the challenge of integrating modern systems into a 1930s structure. The building wasn't designed for contemporary technology, and forcing it to accommodate new infrastructure creates compromises and complications. There's also the philosophical question: at what point does renovation destroy authenticity? The Empire State Building is a designated landmark, which imposes preservation requirements on certain features, but the interior has been gutted and rebuilt multiple times. The windows have been replaced. The electrical, plumbing, and HVAC systems are entirely modern. Is this still the same building that opened in 1931, or is it a modern structure wearing the skin of a historic one? Some preservationists argue that the building's essence lies in its framework and exterior, the steel skeleton and Art Deco facade that define its iconic appearance. Others contend that the building's significance includes the experience of occupying it, which has changed dramatically as modern systems replaced original infrastructure. There's no right answer, but the question becomes urgent as the building ages and requires ever more extensive interventions to remain functional. The next major renovation is already being planned, with discussions about further technological upgrades, accessibility improvements, and structural reinforcement to ensure the building remains viable for another century. Each modification will face the same tension: honoring history while meeting contemporary needs, preserving significance while adapting to change. Not everything that happens in the building appears in official records. Any structure housing thousands of people daily inevitably develops an informal economy and hidden social structures. The Empire State Building is no exception. Maintenance workers know shortcuts and hidden passages that allow them to move through the building faster than elevators. Security staff have informal hierarchies and territories. Long-term tenants develop relationships and systems that operate outside official management channels. But there's a darker side. The building's size and complexity make it difficult to monitor completely. Illegal sublets have occurred, tenants renting office space to others without approval, sometimes at markup. Homeless individuals have occasionally found ways to access the building and hide in seldom used areas, sometimes for days before being discovered. In the 1980s and 1990s, drug dealing allegedly occurred in certain restrooms and stairwells, with dealers using the building's massive foot traffic as cover. The observation deck, despite security, has been used for illegal activities. Proposals to scatter ashes, illegal without permission, graffiti carved into railings and walls, drug transactions in the crowds during peak hours, pickpocketing targeting distracted tourists. Most incidents are minor and handled by security without police involvement, but the sheer volume of visitors makes comprehensive monitoring impossible. There's also the question of what tenants do behind closed doors. The building houses approximately 1,000 businesses, ranging from legitimate corporations to small startups to individual practitioners. Most operate legally, but in a building this large, some inevitably don't. Tax fraud, unlicensed professional services, businesses operating under false pretenses, companies that exist only on paper for financial manipulation purposes, all have been discovered in the building over the decades. The building's maintenance and service staff number in the hundreds. They have access to virtually every space, often working overnight when tenant offices are closed. This access creates opportunities for theft, espionage, and other crimes. Background checks and security protocols exist, but they're not foolproof. Several incidents of employee theft have been prosecuted over the years, and likely many more went undetected. Then there are the systems that operate in plain sight but aren't widely understood. The building has its own ecosystem of service providers, food vendors, cleaning crews, delivery services, maintenance contractors. These businesses depend on access to the building and relationships with its management. How these relationships are negotiated, what informal arrangements exist, who gets lucrative contracts and why. All of this happens through processes that aren't transparent to outsiders or even to most tenants. The question isn't whether illegal or questionable activity occurs in the Empire State Building, it's how much and whether the building's scale makes it impossible to prevent. Any city within a building will have the same problems as actual cities: crime, corruption, informal systems operating outside official channels. The Empire State Building is a vertical city of 25,000 to 30,000 occupants daily. Can it be effectively governed and policed, or will there always be shadows where the light of official oversight doesn't reach? 84 years after opening, the building still rises above Manhattan. But what does it really represent? The Empire State Building is simultaneously a triumph of engineering, a monument to exploitation, a survivor of tragedy, a symbol of American ambition, and the repository of countless human stories, some inspiring, many tragic. It was built by desperate men during America's darkest economic period, constructed at a speed that sacrificed safety for ego. Opened as an expensive failure, transformed by a film about a captive creature dying on its heights, survived the bomber impact, became profitable through decades of struggle, watched over the city during war and peace, and evolved into an icon so powerful that its image transcends its physical reality. The 5 officially recorded construction deaths, or 12 or more depending on which sources you trust, represent men whose names we largely don't know, whose families received minimal compensation, if any, whose sacrifice made the building possible, but whose stories were deliberately minimized to protect the building's image. They died so that John Jacob Raskob and Al Smith could win a competition against Walter Chrysler, so that tourists could stand at the observation deck, so that the building could become the global symbol it is today. The 30-plus people who jumped from the building sought it out specifically because of its fame, its height, its significance. Their deaths weren't random. They chose this location deliberately, making final statements that the building's prominence guaranteed would be noticed. The building didn't kill them, but its existence as a cultural monument shaped their final decisions. Does the building bear responsibility for providing the means, or do we acknowledge that determined individuals will find ways regardless? The empty years, the financial failure, the struggle to achieve occupancy, these reveal that the building's construction was never primarily about economics or practical need. It was about ego, competition, and symbol making. The human cost was externalized onto workers who had no choice but to accept dangerous conditions or starve. The building succeeded ultimately not because its business model made sense, but because its symbolic power became self-sustaining. The bomber crash demonstrated structural resilience while also highlighting vulnerability. The building survived, but people died. It stands as evidence that engineering can overcome tremendous forces, but also that no structure is invulnerable. The comparison to 9/11 is inevitable and uncomfortable. Two attacks on New York landmarks, two different outcomes, two different eras of American experience bracketed by the same city suffering. The hidden spaces, forgotten floors, maintenance workers' ghost stories, electromagnetic mysteries, security vulnerabilities, all suggest a building more complex and unknowable than its clean Art Deco lines suggest. It contains multitudes, conceals secrets, operates according to systems both official and informal. Like any city, it can't be fully known or completely controlled. Modern renovations keep the building functional, but raise questions about authenticity and preservation. How much can you change before the thing itself is lost? The steel framework remains, the exterior facade endures, but the interior has been rebuilt multiple times. Is this still the same building, or a new structure occupying the same space and wearing the same mask? The building will outlast all of us. It was designed to stand for centuries, and with proper maintenance, it likely will. Long after everyone who witnessed its construction has died, after everyone who remembers its empty years and financial struggles is gone, after the victims of its construction and the victims who jumped from it have been forgotten by all but historians, the building will still rise above Manhattan. New generations will visit, take photos, propose marriage, scatter ashes, and perhaps jump. The cycle continues because the building exists as both physical structure and cultural symbol, and symbols never die. So here's the final question, the one that can't be answered with more research or better documentation. Was it worth it? The engineering achievement, the jobs created during the Depression, the cultural impact, the tourism revenue, the symbolic power that inspired millions. Do these outweigh the deaths, the exploitation, the suffering, the tragedies? The building stands. The dead remain dead. We visit, photograph, celebrate, and move on. The Empire State Building is America's most famous structure, precisely because it embodies everything America is: ambitious and ruthless, inspiring and exploitative, beautiful and brutal, reaching always upward while standing on a foundation we'd rather not examine too closely. You decide what it means. The building won't tell you. It just stands, indifferent, waiting for the next person to look up at it in wonder or despair and choose which story they want to believe.